Hello, this is Dennis Niekboer and I'm giving you a video to help you with APA report writing, if this is something that you struggle with, as a lot of students do. So in this video what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the principles of APA manuscript writing. I'm going to introduce you to the referencing guidelines, of which I hope you're already aware, and I'm going to show you the format template that's available to you to make your documents conform to APA manuscript format. Now, the first thing to say about APA manuscript format is that we don't necessarily require it. It's optional. We're not terribly strict about it. What we do expect from your coursework reports is that they are tidily presented in a professional way that is easy to read and that lays out all the information very cleanly. Now that, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. What might look clear and simple to you may not look clear and simple to the reader, including potentially a marker of your work. So we recommend APA report style as a way to make it quite easy for you to make your documents look professional and appropriate to your psychology degree. So what I'm going to talk about can be found here on the Psychology General Blackboard under Study Skills, Study Skills Materials, Help on APA Report Writing. So what you can find here is a set of slides on APA report writing that I'm going to talk you through. The referencing guidelines are also here, and the APA document templates. There's also an example report for inspiration, which you can look at. So this is a previous student's report, which is laid out quite nicely and got a good mark. And there are also various web links to tutorials that you can find online about APA report writing. Let's look at the slides first. So the purpose of writing a report is, of course, that you want to share your findings. You want to present them in written form, to have a permanent record of them, to disseminate them to people who might be interested in your research, and in your case as students, to submit the work for marking, to get a mark for it, to get assessed. Yes, I know you've delivered my parcel, you've just rung at my door. So, in your reading, you will probably have come across reports looking a bit like this. A very nice professional layout, very clear, but varying somewhat from one journal to another. Each journal that you might read has its different way of presenting these things. The paper that the author submitted to the journal in psychology will usually have looked like this, an APA style manuscript, which is what we're going to talk about today. So you can see this is mostly inspired still by the age of the typewriter, but it is quite simple, quite clear, and looks very professional. So you probably already know, because it's all over the textbooks, that an APA manuscript has several sections. There's a title page, an abstract, which we're going to get to last because it's normally what you write last, an introduction section, a method section, a results section, a discussion section, a reference section, and then tables and figures. We're going to talk a little bit about tables and figures later on in terms of how to format them. For your coursework, it's fine to put tables and figures into the main text of your document, Modern word processing software makes that quite easy. But for APA manuscript style, usually you will find tables and figures at the end of the document, each on its own page. Again, this is to do with reprographics. It just helps the person who's going to publish the report to be clear about where the tables and figures are. Either way is fine for your coursework. So let's have a look at the title page layout. At the top you can see that there's a running head. This is actually the case for all pages of the report, which is a short version of the title of your report. A short version because it needs to fit into one line, into the header line, which also has to accommodate the page number. Then you have the manuscript title underneath, centered, and usually a bit further down the page than this. This is just slipped up nearer to the top of the page simply because the page has a very long author note on it, and there was no space further down. Underneath the title you then have the author names and affiliations, so this is a list of the people who contributed to the paper and where they work. In your case, your name is your name, and your affiliation is Canterbury Christ Church University. The author note then has information that is less relevant to you than it is to professional researchers who are submitting something for publication. It includes information such as where the authors are based now, where you can contact them, any acknowledgements for funding, review, help with data collection, and so on. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but most of the author note is not so relevant for you. So thinking about the title for your study, what you're aiming for, the goals of finding a good title for your study, is you want a title that's concise, that's appropriate, and interesting. So let's try to find a good title for this study. This is an example from Britta, a comparative psychologist, tests dogs' understanding of means-end connections, and she finds that the dogs can be trained to pull on a string in order to retrieve food from behind a barrier, if and only if the string is aligned at a right angle to the obstacle, not if the angle is different. And then you have 4 possible titles for this study. One of them is the title that was actually given to the report, and 3 are made up to contravene one or more of the principles of concision, appropriateness, and generating interest. So A, dogs are stupid. B, dogs fail to show understanding of means-end connections in a string pulling task. C, dogs manage to retrieve food by pulling on a string if it's at right angles to a spatial barrier but not otherwise. Or D, dogs' capability for means-end connections. Take a minute to look carefully at these titles and think about which one might be the most appropriate title for an APA manuscript that lives up to the principles of concision, appropriateness, and interest. So, what do you think? The actual title of the document was B. Dogs fail to show understanding of means-end connections in a string pulling task. That's a nice title because it gives away just enough about the main findings of the study for the reader to make sense of it and develop an interest if dogs' capability for means-end connections is something that they're interested in. So it summarizes what the study finds. And that's important if you think about a researcher later on that's looking through quite a large number of reports that are relevant or might be relevant to the topic. The title just simply needs to be informative to enable them to see which reports they want to read further. Dogs Are Stupid, well, that's an inappropriate title. It goes much further than the results of the study would allow. Option C is just simply too wordy, it's not concise enough. And D looks much more like perhaps like a chapter title in a book that contains various chapters, where this chapter perhaps talks about this and similar findings and summarizes them. So D is much more general and doesn't really do a very good job at summarizing the results of this particular study. So, in contrast to a title for a piece of fiction, which is of course designed to create a bit of intrigue, to make a bit of a secret of what's actually going on, the title for an APA manuscript should give the reader some idea of what they're going to read, some idea of what the study is about and what it found. Then we have the introduction. The introduction section, we're going to talk about the content in a moment, but it's formatted like this, and this tells you a lot about how the rest of the report is formatted as well. So you still have the running head as before, page number in the top right, not bottom right, which is the default in a lot of word processing packages. No, you want top right for an APA manuscript. And then the title of the report. A lot of students get this wrong. The introduction section of your report is not actually entitled Introduction. You have as a heading for your introduction section simply the title of your report, what the report is about. And then you can see here what the paragraphs in an APA manuscript look like. So you have particular specifications to do with the size of the typeface, double spacing, margins at the left and right, indentation of the first line of text, as you can see here. All of these are things that you can either define yourself following these guidelines, or you can use the APA format template that we've made available for you. So just to show you that quickly, this is again in the same Blackboard folder. You have APA document templates, which are available in two formats for you. One is the format that's appropriate for OpenOffice or LibreOffice, and one of them is for Microsoft Word. You're very likely to be using one or the other of these word processing packages. I'm going to download the one for LibreOffice because that's what I use, and I'll just open it for you. So you can see here that in the APA document template that you have available to you, the text style is already defined for you. You can see you have a style here called APA body text, which has all the right typefaces, indentations, line spacings, and so on. So you don't need to worry about that anymore. You can just replace this with your own text. It even covers special cases such as block quotations here, and its example text has some information for you about what goes in each section of the report, a reminder for you to make sure that you include what you need to include. Going back now to the presentation. The introduction section is usually quite a substantial section of your report. It needs to cover quite a lot of ground. The general rule is that you move from the general to the specific, so from the topic that you're researching to an introduction and a justification of your own study and its research questions or hypotheses. In detail, you will start by introducing the area of your research. What's the topic of your research? What's it about? And why is it interesting? So, for example, you might want to introduce neurofeedback and recall performance as something that you're researching here. You then explain the relevance of that. Yeah, be as real world as possible. Talk about the applied relevance of this topic. For example, can people use neurofeedback techniques to improve their memory? Might it be a useful technique to help people remember things better? So you introduce an area of research, you explain its relevance, and then you provide a critical literature review of things that have already been published about the topic. Now this is important because it's where you can demonstrate that you've done your homework, you've done your reading, you're aware of the relevant theory and research relating to your topic. You also want to be critical. Critical in the sense of identifying where there are gaps in the literature, identifying whether there are any open questions that your study can answer, identifying whether perhaps a new method could be applied to research on this topic in order to give a new insight into it. So what you're doing here is you're setting up the background of your own study by critically reviewing previous literature, theory, research, methods of research. And by doing that, you're building up to an introduction of your own study. So your own study, you want to explain what you're trying to do, explain the aims of the study. You want to give a brief outline and justification of the methods that you're using. No need for any great detail, that's what the method section is for, but you want to talk here about what it is you're studying, why you're studying it, how you're studying it, and why you're studying it that way. And that should culminate then in a formal statement of your hypothesis, if you're doing a quantitative study that is concerned with hypothesis testing, or your research questions, if your study is exploratory and or qualitative, where of course hypothesis testing is not what you want to do. So of these 4 areas, including introducing the area of research, explaining its relevance, the literature review, and the outline of the present study, which one do you think usually takes up the greatest space? Spend a moment thinking about that. Of course, the literature review is very likely to take up the greatest space, because that's where you give the reader the context of your research, the gaps in previous literature that have inspired you to do your study. Now, admittedly, this can be more difficult to do when you're an undergraduate student and you're writing about a piece of research that you haven't designed yourself. This is the case in your first year, for example. But what you can do here is you can show that you have an awareness of the literature around the topic and how your own study fits into it. Following the introduction section, you have your method section. You can see here that the method section usually has subheadings. So you have your section heading, simply called method, and then, as you can see, aligned left rather than centered, you have your subheadings. In this case, you can see participants here, design here. We're going to talk about the various possible subsections in a moment. It may be worth just reminding you that the purpose of the method section is to make your study replicable. That is, somebody who's not familiar with the study but reads your report about it should be able then to go and do exactly the same study, to run exactly the same study themselves. That is only possible, of course, if your method section includes all the required information that is needed to run your study and presents it in a very, very clear way that allows the reader to go away and do just the same thing. Now that means that the style of the method section is usually very technical, and what you're aiming for is really to summarize quite a lot of information in as concise a way as possible to enable the reader to replicate your study exactly without descending into waffle and wasting words. The way this is achieved is by making sure that you cover all the right information that the reader needs to replicate your study. And this is where these subheadings are useful, to remind you of what you need to cover. Incidentally, it's quite a good idea to read and reread your method section lots of times to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything that might be required for readability, and perhaps let another person look at it to see whether you're making yourself clear enough, whether the reader feels confident that they could go out and do the same study. So, typical subsections for the method section are these ones on the slide here. So, participants. This includes things about your sampling strategy. Did you do a random sample? Did you do an opportunity sample? Some sort of quota sample? And who are your participants? The sample characteristics including distribution of genders, for example, typical ages of your participants, where they come from, a bit about their background, as much as is relevant to your study. Then you might want to talk about your design. So if you're doing an experiment, for example, you will want to talk about your independent and dependent variables and the way that you manipulated and measured them. If you're doing a questionnaire survey, then you will want to nominate the variables that you measured. Whereas if you're doing, say, an interview study, you would just say that this was an interview study designed to cover these and these topics. In materials then, you would go into detail about the sorts of things that you need in order to run the study. Your interview schedule, for example, if you're doing an interview study, would be explained here. You would perhaps give a few sample questions from the interview schedule, possibly with a reference to an appendix that includes the complete interview schedule. Similarly, for a questionnaire study, you will want to talk here about the variables that you measured, the sorts of items with which you measured them. For example, Likert scale measuring satisfaction with life, let's say, any literature sources from which you've taken these items, and so on. Again, you might want to refer to an appendix in which you actually include the whole questionnaire. If you're doing an experiment, you will want to explain what sort of materials or apparatus might be required to run the experiment. For example, do you need a set of EEG equipment to measure, for EEG measurement, or do you need some sort of computerized system for presenting stimuli to participants, like Superlab or one of those packages? So that's what you mention in materials. Then procedure is usually quite a substantial section that explains essentially your participants' experience of participating in your interview. So starting from welcoming the participants all the way through what you do and say to your participants throughout the study. And usually chronologically is the best way to go through it, and you will want to include enough detail to make your procedure transparent and replicable. So everything that you say to your participants, anything that you do to your participants would go in the procedure. Ethics are extremely important to cover in the method section, but not necessarily under a separate subheading, because a lot of the ethical aspects of your study will be in the procedure, in how you treat your participants. So you need to make clear in your method section that you've treated your participants fairly, that you kept their data confidential, for example by guaranteeing anonymity in a questionnaire study or whatever is relevant to your study. You will want to talk about data safekeeping and all of those things. There's a separate textbook chapter and a separate lecture on ethics. There's no time now to talk about all of this in detail, but just to say that ethics will need to be involved in your method section. Then the results section is obviously going to look quite different depending on whether you've done a quantitative or a qualitative study. Here's an example from a quantitative study, first of all. And any quantitative results section will want to include some descriptive statistics, first of all. As you know from way back at the beginning of your first year of study, descriptive statistics are about how you can describe your sample data. This will usually involve some measure of central tendency, means or medians, whatever is appropriate, and some measure of dispersion, such as standard deviations. Then you will report your inferential statistics. These are the statistical tests that you use to make judgments on probability and test your hypothesis. So let's look at this extract. Descriptive statistics are referred to here as something that can be found in a table. That's fine. You can see here also that the descriptive statistics relating to the two different conditions of this experiment are given there. And the inferential test, in this case a paired t-test, is reported here, followed by a statement of rejection of the null hypothesis and an explanation of what the effect is. A word about notation. So as you can see, APA style requires the mean to be notated with an uppercase M in italics. Standard deviation is a lowercase s in italics. And the t-test is reported like this. So lowercase t, in brackets you have the number of degrees of freedom, which here is 19. Then you have the value of t. With most statistics in APA reports, it makes sense to round them to 2 decimals. And then finally the p-value. In this case, p is given as smaller than 0.05. Depending on the outcome of your test, of course, you may have p smaller than 0.01, you may have p greater than 0.05, so a non-significant effect by most standards. Or indeed, you might want to report the exact p-value that your statistics program produces for you. For example, p equals 0.03. Tables and figures might be useful in this section, and you should refer to them clearly in your text. So you can see here, for example, the author is saying you can find this in table 2 and you can find that in figure 1. So that the reader is left in no doubt about what they can find where. By contrast, a qualitative results section, of course, will not have any statistics reported in it. Instead, it'll take the form of some sort of analytic narrative with quotations from the raw data that illustrate and justify that analysis. So the analytic narrative, that's your words. That's the analysis that you're explaining to the reader. And quotations from the raw data are inserted there to make intelligible to your reader that you haven't plucked your analytic points out of thin air, that they are grounded in the data, that they are clearly justified by the data. To set quotations apart from the rest of the text, you would use indentation. In this example, I've also used a slightly smaller typeface. That's just to fit it on the slide. For your written reports, I recommend you use block quotations like this one here in the APA format template. So it's simply an indentation to set the quotation apart from the rest of the text. Now, of course, qualitative results sections, because they include your own analytic narrative and the quotations that you've inserted for illustration and justification, can be quite lengthy. So in a qualitative results section especially, it's important to ensure that the main message of your findings, the gist, is always clear to the reader. So it's worth again reading this section lots and lots of times to make sure that the main message of your analysis is always clear to the person that's reading it. Then we have the discussion section. So whereas the results section was about explaining, actually perhaps more precisely describing your findings, describing your analysis and its outcomes, the discussion section is about interpreting it, thinking about what your findings mean and what they represent in the context of previous research. So your discussion section will start out with a summary of your main findings, the main messages of your analysis, and then with reference to previous literature and with reference to the research question that you asked at the beginning, talk about the meaning of those findings. For example, where do your findings support previous literature? Where are they in contradiction with previous literature? And how do they extend previous research? So you can see here that the interpretation of your findings should be done with reference to the literature that you've introduced in the introduction section. Following that, you will want to reflect on your own study and its methods. This might include weaknesses, where the implementation of the study perhaps could have been improved, but perhaps more importantly also the limitations of your methods. As you know, different methods allow us to draw different kinds of conclusions, and no study will be able to answer all possible research questions. So for example, if you've done a survey and you've found an association between two variables, perhaps in the form of a significant correlation, you know from what you know about research methods that that doesn't allow you to make a causal statement. You found an association, not a cause and effect relationship. So being clear about what your methods allow you to conclude and what they don't allow you to conclude is something that you would need to make clear here. And finally, you will want to mention some possible implications of your research. What do your findings imply for future research? In other words, which study ideas emerge from your findings and your interpretation of those findings? What could be productively studied in the future to advance our understanding of the phenomenon that you studied? And what might your findings imply for application outside of the research context? To use a phrase that I don't like very much, what do they mean for the real world? The reason why I don't like it when people say that is because it makes it sound as if psychological research isn't happening in the real world and not happening with real people and so on. Oh, of course, it's all about people. That's what psychology is. But anyway, what do your findings mean for the world outside of psychological research? What's the applied relevance? How can we use it to improve people's lives, essentially? A question that students often ask is, can I talk about my own opinion in the discussion section? Reflect on that for a minute, and then I'll tell you what the usual answer is. So what do you think? Well, the usual answer is that yes, you can talk about your own opinion in the discussion section, but it needs to be an opinion that is clearly grounded in the literature and in the findings that you've just written about. So, of course, if you're interpreting your findings and contextualizing them, your own opinion is going to be involved in some way, but it needs to be an opinion that isn't just plucked out of thin air. It needs to be something that clearly relates to what you've written about. After the discussion section, you will have a reference section in which you list the references that have been cited in your report. On Blackboard, in the same folder that we've been throughout, Help on APA Report Writing, you have the referencing guidelines, with which you're probably already familiar. I won't talk much about this document, just to say that it exists, and it should be used when you prepare your reports and indeed your essays as well. So it talks you through some general information on referencing, why good referencing is needed, common mistakes, and then some details about the format for the author year in text citations, as well as the reference section at the end of your document. So most of the common reference formats that you're going to need are there, from journal articles to conference presentations. So highly recommended, if not obligatory. So let's look at this example reference, for instance. Abel and Condor, No Man's an Island, English and Scottish Representations of National Geography, paper presented at the Sperry Research Seminar, University of Surrey, Guildford, UK. Is this a reference to a journal article, a book chapter, or a presentation? What do you think? That's right, it's obviously a presentation at the Sperry Research Seminar. Next example. Does this reference refer to a journal article, book chapter, or presentation? What do you think? Yes, it's obviously a journal article, where the title of the journal is here, the volume number and issue number here, and the page numbers there. And this example, what's this? Correct, it's a book chapter. So Francis Aboud has written this chapter, which has this title, and the editors of the book were Davidio, Glick and Rudman. Here's the title of the book. Here are the pages in the book where you can find this chapter, and like any reference to a book, it has the place of publication and the publisher. And what about this? Is this a journal article, book chapter, or presentation? What do you think? of course, this is a book. So these are the names of the authors, year of publication, title of the book, place of publication, and publisher. Finally, we get to the abstract. As I said at the beginning, the abstract is probably what you will write last about your report, because its purpose is to summarize the whole report. It will say something about the context of your study, which will relate to some content of your introduction section. It will say something about your methods. It will mention your main results, your main findings, and it will say something about the implications of your work. So the 4 main report sections should be in some way represented in your abstract. The abstract, formally speaking, appears separately on page 2 of your APA manuscript. That is, you have your title page, then on the next page you have the abstract, and then on page 3 the introduction of the report starts. Look at this example abstract. In which order are the 4 main sections of the report represented in this text? Have a careful read and see whether A, B, C or D is correct. Yes, of course. It's in exactly the same order as they appear in the report. So the text highlighted in blue there says something about the context of your research, mentioned in your introduction, of course. The text in red is about the methods that you used to examine your research question. The text in green summarizes the main findings, and the text in blue at the bottom is about contextualizing your findings with regard to previous literature and talks about the implications of what you found. Something to say about tables and figures. As you can see, APA format requires a particular format for tables and figures as well, and they're quite different from the sorts of things that SPSS spits out at you. So please do not just copy and paste tables from SPSS. They're not just in awkward formats, they also usually include information that really isn't needed. Your tables should give the reader the information that they need and no more. So you can see here, for example, that the table uses very few horizontal lines and no vertical lines at all. And that space is being saved here by numbering the variables and explaining the numbering here. So in this table you can see, for example, that the correlation between variable 1, psychosocial adjustment, and variable 4, separation, is -0.33, and that this is a significant correlation. The APA format template that I've previously shown you has an example table at the back as well, which looks fairly similar and which perhaps you can adapt to your own needs. And it also includes an example of a figure. A figure will usually be some sort of graph, perhaps a photo, or some other sort of graphical representation. What's really important is that you can take published psychological literature as an example to get you to think about the sorts of things that are necessary, the sorts of things that are not necessary. And this goes not just for tables and figures, but for the whole report. Look at lots of published papers for inspiration. The more you read, the more you will develop a feel for what is right and what is wrong with report writing. At the same time, of course, there are lots of guidelines, lots of help that we've put in place for you, including the slides that I've been talking about, the reference format template that I've shown you, and the referencing guidelines that you already know. So make use of those materials and observe them. Finally, make sure that the linguistic presentation of your report is good in terms of tidy presentation, professional look and feel, good spelling, and good grammar. These things really do matter, because you can imagine that the meaning of what it is you're trying to say may be obscured by things such as poor grammar, poor written expression, and markers will not be able to give you points, to give you credits for something that they can't understand. So it's always worth double checking whether your writing is making sense, and perhaps using the help of another person to read through your report to tell you where you're making sense and where perhaps you're not making sense. Finally, report writing is a skill, and as with any skill, it may not work very well for you first time, but practice makes perfect. Like any skill, report writing can be trained, it can be learned. So even if your first attempt at report writing doesn't go well, observe the feedback, go back to the instructional material that you've been given, go back to the literature, take that as an example, and you will improve over time. Like with any other skill, it's trainable. You'll be all right. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope this is something that you can refer back to as you go through your degree. Happy report writing, and see you soon.